Picture yourself standing at the edge of a jungle clearing, sweat dripping down your face, mosquitoes buzzing in your ears. Behind you, 17 exhausted men, some barely able to stand. Ahead of you, a concrete fortress crawling with 350 Imperial Japanese soldiers who have sworn to fight to the death. You have no tanks, no air support, no artillery. Your ammunition is nearly gone. Logic says you should retreat. Survival says you should run. But something deeper, something almost reckless, tells you to walk straight through those gates and convince an enemy that has never surrendered to lay down their weapons. Not with bullets, not with bombs, but with words, with nerve, with a gamble so dangerous that if it fails, you and every man behind you will die screaming. This is not a legend whispered around campfires. This is not Hollywood fiction stretched for drama. This is the true story of Lieutenant Marcus Chen, a farm boy from California who became a translator, who became a warrior, and who on one sweltering afternoon in the Philippines pulled off a deception so audacious that even 70 years later, military historians struggled to explain how it worked. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. August 1945. The war in the Pacific had become a furnace of blood and fire. Island after island had fallen to American forces, each one purchased with thousands of lives. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Saipan. The names had become synonyms for slaughter. But victory in the Pacific was never guaranteed by winning battles alone. Japan's empire had stretched across thousands of miles, and hidden within that vast expanse were countless pockets of resistance, fortified positions where fanatical defenders prepared to make the Allies pay in blood for every inch of ground. The Philippine Islands had been liberated months earlier, or so the headlines declared. General MacArthur had waded ashore, cameras rolling, proclaiming his famous return. Manila had been freed after devastating urban combat that left the city in ruins. But liberation on a map and liberation on the ground were two very different things. Across the archipelago, Japanese units refused to accept defeat. Some had retreated into the mountains, others had dug into coastal fortifications, convinced that the Imperial fleet would return, that reinforcements would arrive, that the tide of war would somehow, miraculously, turn back in their favor. One such position sat on the northern coast of Luzon, a place the locals called Barangay del Norte, though the Americans had simply marked it on their maps as Objective Crimson. It was a supply depot, a communications hub, and a prisoner of war camp all rolled into one sprawling complex. The Japanese had built it in 1942, during the early days of occupation, pouring concrete and steel into bunkers that could withstand naval bombardment. They had strung barbed wire across approaches, planted mines in the surrounding fields, and positioned machine gun nests with overlapping fields of fire. The position was commanded by Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto, a veteran of the China campaign, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by his unwavering loyalty to the emperor. Under his command were 350 soldiers, a mix of Imperial Army regulars, naval infantry, and support troops who had been scattered by earlier American advances and had regrouped here for a final stand. Intelligence reports reaching American headquarters painted a grim picture. Somewhere within that fortress were 43 Allied prisoners of war, men who had been captured during the desperate fighting of 1942 and had survived 3 years of starvation, disease, and brutality. Some were American servicemen. Others were Filipino resistance fighters who had been caught and tortured for information. Reconnaissance flights had spotted crude wooden barracks near the center of the complex, surrounded by guard towers and electrified fencing. The prisoners were bargaining chips, human shields, and in the twisted logic of a losing war, potential victims of a final atrocity if the Japanese command decided that honor demanded their deaths rather than their liberation. Freeing them would require either a massive frontal assault that would likely kill the prisoners in the crossfire, or a surgical strike so precise that it bordered on impossible. Lieutenant Marcus Chen was not supposed to be anywhere near the fighting. He had grown up in the Central Valley of California, the son of immigrants who had scraped together enough money to buy a small farm. He spoke Cantonese at home, English at school, and had learned Japanese from a neighbor who ran a grocery store. When war broke out and Executive Order 9066 sent Japanese Americans to internment camps, Chen had volunteered for the army, partly out of patriotism, partly to prove his loyalty, and partly because staying home meant watching his parents lose everything they had built. The army had recognized his language skills and assigned him to the intelligence service, training him as a translator and interrogator. He had spent 2 years hopping from island to island, interviewing prisoners, translating captured documents, and occasionally going on patrol to question locals about enemy movements. But Chen was no desk officer content to stay behind the lines. He had a restless energy, a need to be where the action was thickest. He had talked his way into airborne training, earned his jump wings, and volunteered for every dangerous assignment that came across his desk. By the summer of 1945, he had been in more firefights than most infantry platoon leaders, had been wounded twice, and had earned a reputation as someone who could talk his way into or out of almost any situation. His superiors valued him for his linguistic skills. His fellow soldiers respected him because he never asked them to go anywhere he wouldn't go first. And the Japanese prisoners he interrogated feared him, not because he was cruel, but because he had an unsettling ability to get inside their heads, to understand what they were thinking, to anticipate their moves before they made them. When the briefing came down about Objective Crimson, Chen was sitting in a tent at a forward base, sweating through his uniform and writing a letter home. A runner found him and told him to report to the command post immediately. Inside, a tired-looking colonel spread a map across a folding table and got straight to the point. They had located the prisoner of war camp. They had eyes on the fortress, and they needed someone who spoke Japanese to go in with a small reconnaissance team, assess the situation, and report back on whether a rescue operation was feasible. The colonel made it clear that this was strictly observation, no heroics, no cowboy nonsense. Get in, get the intel, get out. Chen nodded, saluted, and walked out of that tent already knowing he was going to do more than just observe. The team assembled the next morning. 18 men, all volunteers, all hand-picked for different skills. There were scouts from the Alamo Scouts, an elite reconnaissance unit that had been operating behind Japanese lines for months. There were 2 medics, a radio operator, a demolitions expert, and a dozen infantrymen from the 37th Division who had been fighting in the Philippines since the landings. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. They were lean, hard men with hollow eyes, and the kind of quiet competence that came from surviving month after month of jungle warfare. Chen briefed them on what little intelligence they had. The fortress was approximately 8 miles inland, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense jungle and across 2 rivers. Japanese patrols were active in the area, but infrequent. The bigger danger was the terrain itself, which was a miserable tangle of vines, thorns, sucking mud, and insects that could drain a man's strength faster than any enemy bullet. They moved out before dawn, slipping into the jungle as the first gray light filtered through the canopy. The heat was immediate and oppressive, a wet, suffocating blanket that made every breath feel like work. Within an hour, their uniforms were soaked through. Within 2 hours, the first man went down with heat exhaustion and had to be carried. They moved slowly, carefully, every sense straining for the crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the telltale signs of an ambush. The jungle was alive with sound, birds shrieking, monkeys howling, insects droning in a maddening chorus that made it nearly impossible to hear anything else. Chen walked near the front of the column, his Thompson submachine gun held loosely, his mind running through Japanese phrases he might need. Surrender. Cease fire. We have you surrounded. The words felt inadequate, like trying to stop an avalanche with a whisper. They reached the first river by midday and forded it in waist-deep water, holding their weapons over their heads, every man watching the far bank for snipers. Nothing. The silence was almost worse than gunfire. It meant the Japanese either didn't know they were coming, or they knew and were waiting. On the far side, they climbed a low ridge and got their first look at Objective Crimson. It sat in a valley, a cluster of concrete buildings surrounded by a perimeter fence, guard towers rising at each corner like the teeth of some mechanical beast. Smoke drifted from cooking fires. Figures moved between buildings, too distant to make out details, but the disciplined way they moved suggested soldiers, not prisoners. Chen studied the layout through binoculars, committing every detail to memory. The prisoner barracks were exactly where intelligence had said they would be, near the center, isolated from the main garrison. Getting to them would mean crossing 200 yards of open ground under the guns of at least 4 towers. As the sun began to sink, painting the jungle in shades of orange and red, Chen made a decision. He turned to the senior scout, a sergeant named Webb, who had survived Guadalcanal and New Guinea, and told him they weren't going back. Not yet. Not until they knew for certain whether a rescue was possible. Webb stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The rest of the team accepted the decision without complaint. They had come this far. They would see it through. That night, they moved closer, crawling through elephant grass, slipping between trees until they were less than 300 yards from the perimeter fence. They could hear voices now, Japanese soldiers laughing, arguing, singing songs that drifted through the darkness like ghosts.
Chen listened, picking out words, phrases, anything that might give him insight into the morale of the garrison. What he heard troubled him. These men were not defeated. They were not demoralized. They were preparing for a fight, cleaning weapons, reinforcing positions, talking about honor and duty and dying with glory. The next morning, Chen did something that terrified every man in his unit. He stood up, walked to the edge of the jungle, and studied the fortress in full daylight. He was close enough now to see faces, to read the expressions of the sentries in the towers. They looked tired but alert, scanning the jungle with binoculars, watching for threats. If any of them looked in his direction, if any of them saw movement, they would sound the alarm and the entire garrison would come pouring out. But Chen needed to see. He needed to understand. He needed to count heads, identify strong points, find weaknesses. After 10 minutes that felt like 10 hours, he slipped back into the jungle and gathered his team. He told them what he had seen, and then he told them what he was going to do. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Webb thought he was insane. The medics looked at him like he had a death wish. Even the demolitions expert, a man who made a living playing with high explosives, shook his head in disbelief. Chen's plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. He would walk into the fortress under a flag of truce and convince Colonel Yamamoto to surrender, not by threatening him with overwhelming force, because they had no such force, not by appealing to his humanity, because 3 years of war had burned most of that away, but by exploiting the one thing Chen had learned about the Japanese command structure during countless interrogations: their obsession with honor, with saving face, with finding a way to justify the unjustifiable. He would offer Yamamoto a way to surrender that would allow him to tell his men, and more importantly, to tell himself, that he had not betrayed the emperor, but had made a tactical decision to preserve his soldiers' lives in the face of an enemy too powerful to resist. It was a bluff built on psychology, on cultural understanding, on reading people, and on one critical lie that Chen would have to sell with every ounce of conviction he possessed. The team spent the rest of the day preparing. Webb argued for 3 solid hours, trying every angle to convince Chen to abandon this suicide mission and call for reinforcements. But Chen knew reinforcements would take days, maybe weeks, and by then the prisoners might be dead, executed in a final spasm of rage by captors who knew defeat was inevitable. The radio operator tried to contact headquarters, but the dense jungle and the mountains made communication impossible. They were on their own, cut off, with no support and no backup plan. As the sun set on their second night in the jungle, Chen wrote a letter to his parents, sealed it in a waterproof pouch, and headed it to Webb with instructions to make sure it got home if things went wrong. Then he cleaned his Thompson, checked his sidearm, and tried to sleep. He managed maybe 2 hours, his mind racing through scenarios, through words, through the dozen ways this could end in disaster. Dawn broke humid and gray. Chen stripped off his gear, keeping only his sidearm and a white undershirt tied to a length of bamboo. He stood at the edge of the jungle, took a deep breath, and walked into the open.
Behind him, hidden in the undergrowth, 17 men watched with a mixture of awe and horror as their translator, their friend, their brother-in-arms, stepped into the kill zone and began the longest, loneliest walk of his life. The distance from the jungle's edge to the main gate measured exactly 230 yards. Chen had paced it out in his mind a dozen times, calculating angles, estimating firing positions, imagining where the bullets would come from when the shooting started. Because there would be shooting. Every instinct screamed that this was madness, that he was walking toward his own execution, that the white flag tied to his bamboo pole meant nothing to men who had been taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. Yet with each step forward, his breathing steadied, his hands stopped shaking. A strange calm settled over him, the kind of clarity that comes when a man accepts that he has crossed a line from which there is no return. The first shout came from the nearest tower. A sentry had spotted him, was yelling down to the soldiers below, pointing frantically. Within seconds, alarm bells clanged across the compound. Men poured from barracks, grabbing rifles, taking positions along the perimeter. Chen kept walking, holding the white flag high, his other hand raised palm out in the universal gesture of peace. He could see faces now, young faces mostly, boys really, their features hardened by war, but still showing traces of the fear that gripped every soldier when confronted with the unexpected. A machine gun in the tower swiveled toward him, the barrel tracking his movement. Chen forced himself not to look at it, not to acknowledge the weapon that could cut him in half before he took another breath. At 50 yards from the gate, a voice barked out in Japanese, ordering him to stop. Chen halted immediately, standing perfectly still, the white flag fluttering in the morning breeze. The voice belonged to a lieutenant, a young officer with a drawn sword who stood just inside the gate, his face twisted with confusion and rage. He demanded to know who Chen was, what he wanted, why he dared approach a military installation under arms. Chen responded in flawless Japanese, his accent carefully neutral, his tone respectful but firm. He identified himself as Lieutenant Marcus Chen, United States Army Intelligence, and requested an immediate audience with Colonel Yamamoto on a matter of mutual survival. The word survival hung in the air like smoke. The lieutenant hesitated, his sword wavering slightly. Behind him, soldiers muttered to each other, uncertain, waiting for orders. Minutes crawled by. Chen stood motionless, sweat rolling down his back, his muscles screaming from the tension of holding himself so rigidly still. Finally, the lieutenant barked an order. 2 soldiers emerged from the gate, rifles leveled, and approached cautiously. They patted him down roughly, searching for weapons, finding only his holstered pistol, which they removed with trembling hands. One of them, barely 18 by the look of him, stared at Chen with wide eyes, as if trying to reconcile the enemy uniform with the face that spoke their language. They bound his hands in front of him with rough cord, tight enough to bite into his wrists, but not so tight to cut off circulation. Then they marched him through the gate into the fortress itself. The interior of Objective Crimson was organized chaos. Soldiers moved with purpose, carrying ammunition boxes, reinforcing sandbag positions, preparing for an assault they believed was imminent. Chen's appearance had thrown them into confusion, but their training held. They did not panic.
They did not abandon their posts. They simply watched him with hard, suspicious eyes as he was led through the compound toward the largest building, a 2-story concrete structure that served as both headquarters and barracks for the senior officers. The guards shoved him through a doorway into a dim corridor that smelled of mildew and tobacco smoke. At the end of the corridor, a door stood open, and through it, Chen could see a desk, maps pinned to walls,
and a figure standing with his back turned, studying something on a table. Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto was smaller than Chen had imagined, barely 5.5 feet tall, but he carried himself with the rigid bearing of a career officer who had spent decades commanding men. His uniform was immaculate, despite the jungle heat, his boots polished to a mirror shine. When he turned to face Chen, his expression revealed nothing, a mask of stone that gave away no emotion, no surprise, no curiosity. He dismissed the guards with a curt gesture, and suddenly Chen was alone with the man who held the power of life and death over 43 prisoners and 350 soldiers who had sworn to fight to the last bullet. Yamamoto circled Chen slowly, studying him the way a scientist might examine an interesting specimen. He spoke in clipped, precise Japanese, asking questions that seemed almost casual, but were designed to probe, to test, to uncover weakness. How had Chen learned Japanese? Where had he trained? What unit was he with? Chen answered truthfully, knowing that lies would be detected instantly by a man this experienced. He spoke of his childhood, his neighbor who had taught him the language, his training as a translator. He did not mention his parents' farm, did not speak of internment camps, did not give Yamamoto any personal details that could be used as leverage. Instead, he steered the conversation toward the present, toward the situation both men found themselves in, toward the reality that neither could ignore. Yamamoto sat down behind his desk, gesturing for Chen to remain standing. It was a power play, a subtle assertion of dominance, but Chen accepted it without protest. The colonel lit a cigarette, drew deeply, and exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. Then he asked the question Chen had been waiting for. What did the American want? Why had he walked into this fortress alone? What possible reason could justify such foolishness? Chen took a breath and launched into the most important speech of his life. He spoke of the war's trajectory, of Japan's strategic position, of the reality that every officer with eyes could see, but few would acknowledge. The home islands were under blockade. The Imperial Navy had been shattered. City after city had been reduced to ash by American bombers. The Soviet Union had entered the war, crushing Japanese forces in Manchuria. Resistance, no matter how brave, no matter how honorable, could not change the outcome. Yamamoto's face remained impassive, but Chen saw the flicker in his eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. These were truths the colonel knew, but could never speak out loud to his men. To do so would be to admit defeat, to betray everything they had fought for, to dishonor the memory of those who had already died. Chen pressed forward, shifting his approach. He spoke of the prisoners, of the 43 men who had suffered for 3 years, who had done nothing to deserve their fate beyond being captured in battle. He spoke of the inevitability of American forces arriving in overwhelming numbers, of the artillery bombardment that would precede any assault, and of the certainty that those prisoners would die in the crossfire unless someone acted to prevent it.
The colonel stubbed out his cigarette with deliberate slowness. He stood, walked to the window, and stared out at his fortress, at the men he commanded, at the perimeter defenses they had built with their own hands. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost reflective. He told Chen a story about Saipan, about watching from a distance as the garrison there had fought to annihilation, as thousands of civilians had thrown themselves from cliffs rather than face capture, as the last defenders had charged American machine guns with nothing but bayonets and the desperate hope that their deaths would mean something. Yamamoto had seen the photographs, had read the reports, had listened to the whispered accounts of survivors who spoke of caves filled with the dead, of beaches stained red, of an entire island consumed by madness born of desperation. He turned back to Chen, and for the first time, the mask cracked. Exhaustion showed through, a bone-deep weariness that came from knowing the war was lost but being unable to acknowledge it,
from bearing the responsibility for hundreds of lives with no good options left, from serving a code of honor that demanded the impossible. Yamamoto asked the question that mattered. What was Chen offering? What terms would justify surrender? What face-saving lie could he tell his men that would allow them to lay down their weapons without feeling that they had betrayed their oaths, their country, their souls? This was the moment Chen had gambled everything on. He straightened despite his bound hands and delivered the bluff with absolute conviction. Outside this fortress, he said, were 5,000 American troops supported by artillery, tanks, and air power. They had surrounded the position during the night and were prepared to assault at dawn. The bombardment would be merciless, designed to obliterate every structure, every bunker, every living thing within the perimeter. But Chen had convinced his commanders to delay the attack, to give Yamamoto one chance to spare his men from pointless slaughter. Not surrender, Chen emphasized, his voice hard and clear. Strategic withdrawal. A tactical decision to preserve trained soldiers for the defense of the home islands, where they would be needed for the final battle. The prisoners would be released as a gesture of military professionalism, soldier to soldier, a recognition that the rules of war still mattered even in this savage conflict. It was a beautiful lie, layered with just enough truth to be believable. There were American forces in the region, just not 5,000 of them. There would eventually be an assault on this position, just not at dawn tomorrow. The suggestion that Japan might still mount a successful defense of the home islands was fantasy, but it was a fantasy that every Japanese officer clung to because the alternative was unthinkable. Chen watched Yamamoto's face, searching for any sign that the bluff had landed, that the seed of doubt had been planted. The colonel returned to his desk, pulled out a map, and spread it across the surface. He asked about positions, about unit designations, about the specific commanders of this phantom force. Chen answered with confidence, naming real American divisions that were operating elsewhere in the Philippines, describing dispositions that were plausible if not accurate, weaving a tapestry of details that supported the central lie. Yamamoto studied the map for a long time, his fingers tracing roads and terrain features, his mind working through scenarios. Finally, he asked the critical question. If he agreed to this strategic withdrawal, what guarantee did he have that his men would not be massacred once they disarmed? Chen had prepared for this. He spoke of the Geneva Conventions, of American policy toward prisoners of war, of the fundamental difference between the two nations' treatment of captured enemies. He did not mention the atrocities committed by Japanese forces, did not speak of the Bataan Death March or the thousands of prisoners who had died in captivity. Instead, he framed it as a matter of military professionalism, of officers honoring their word, of the understanding that today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally in the uncertain world that would follow this war's end. The colonel walked to a filing cabinet, removed a folder, and laid it on the desk.
Inside were photographs, letters, personal effects of his men. He spoke quietly about their families, about the villages they came from, about the wives and children who waited for news that would never come if this fortress became another Saipan. His voice cracked slightly when he mentioned a young corporal whose wife had just given birth to a son, a boy the father would never meet if he died here defending a position that no longer mattered to the war's outcome. It was in that moment that Chen understood he had won, not through the strength of his bluff, not through the fear of overwhelming force, but through the simple human reality that no commander wants to be responsible for the needless deaths of men under his charge when an alternative exists. Yamamoto closed the folder and looked directly at Chen. He said he would need to consult with his senior officers, that such a decision could not be made alone. Chen nodded, understanding this was face-saving protocol, a way for the colonel to spread the responsibility and avoid bearing the full weight of what would be seen as betrayal by hardliners within his own ranks. Yamamoto called for the guards,
ordered them to place Chen in a holding room, but to treat him with respect as a military officer, not as a prisoner. As Chen was led away, the colonel spoke one final sentence. He would have an answer by sunset. If he decided to accept the American terms, a white flag would be raised over the headquarters building. If not, Chen would be executed as a spy and the fortress would fight to the last man. Chen spent the next 6 hours in the small room with barred windows, his hands still bound, his mind racing through everything that could go wrong. He could hear voices through the walls, heated arguments in Japanese, officers debating, shouting, pleading their cases. Some wanted to fight, to uphold the warrior code, to die with honor rather than face the shame of surrender. Others argued for pragmatism, for survival, for the chance to return home when the war finally ended. The debate raged for hours, and Chen sat listening, understanding every word, knowing that his life and the lives of the prisoners hung on which faction won this internal battle. Outside, hidden in the jungle, Webb and the rest of the team waited in agony. They had heard the alarm bells, had seen Chen being led into the fortress at gunpoint, and had spent the day expecting to hear the crack of a rifle shot that would signal his execution. Webb had the radio operator trying desperately to reach headquarters, to call in reinforcements, to do anything that might save their lieutenant. But the radio remained silent, the mountains blocking their signal, leaving them isolated and helpless. Some of the men wanted to assault the fortress immediately, to go down fighting rather than abandon Chen. Webb held them back, reminding them that Chen had ordered them to wait, to give him until sunset, to trust that he knew what he was doing. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, Chen heard footsteps approaching his cell. The door opened, and a sergeant gestured for him to stand. He was led back through the compound, past soldiers who now looked at him with curiosity rather than hatred, to the headquarters building where Colonel Yamamoto waited. The colonel's face was haggard, as if he had aged 10 years in 6 hours. He gestured to a chair, and for the first time invited Chen to sit. Then he poured 2 cups of tea from a pot on his desk, placed one in front of Chen, and cut the cords binding his wrists with a small knife. Yamamoto drank his tea slowly, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was steady but laden with resignation. He had convinced his officers, or at least enough of them, that tactical withdrawal was the only rational course. They would release the prisoners immediately. They would disarm over the next 12 hours, stacking weapons in designated areas under American supervision. His men would be treated as prisoners of war with all the protections that status afforded. In exchange, Chen must guarantee safe passage, fair treatment, and the understanding that this was not surrender, but withdrawal, not cowardice, but strategy.
Chen agreed to every term, his relief so profound he nearly collapsed. But he kept his face neutral, matching Yamamoto's dignity, understanding that this moment required respect above all else. The colonel stood and extended his hand. It was a gesture that transcended culture and conflict, a recognition of one officer to another, of shared humanity in the midst of inhumanity. Chen shook his hand firmly, and in that grip felt the weight of what they had both just accomplished. Yamamoto called for his adjutant and issued the orders. The white flag was to be raised immediately. All units were to cease defensive preparations and begin the process of disarmament. The prisoners were to be released to American custody within the hour, and a delegation would escort Lieutenant Chen back to the perimeter to meet with the American commanders and coordinate the withdrawal. As Chen walked back through the compound, now accompanied by Japanese officers rather than guarded by soldiers with rifles, he saw the white flag climbing slowly up the pole above the headquarters building. It caught the last rays of sunlight, glowing like a beacon against the darkening sky. In the jungle, Webb saw it through his binoculars and nearly wept with relief. He gathered the team, and together they moved to the edge of the clearing, weapons ready but held low, prepared to receive their lieutenant and discover whether this impossible gamble had truly succeeded. The main gate swung open, and Chen emerged, walking steadily, flanked by 3 Japanese officers who looked shell-shocked by what they had just agreed to. Behind them came the prisoners, 43 skeletal figures in tattered uniforms, some limping, some being carried by their stronger comrades, all of them blinking in the fading light as if unable to believe they were finally free. They stumbled toward the American line, toward Webb and the others who rushed forward to catch them, to support them, to welcome them back from hell. Chen stopped at the perimeter, turned back to face Yamamoto, who stood at the gate watching, and saluted. The colonel returned the salute with mechanical precision, then turned and walked back into his fortress to oversee its dismantling. Over the next 12 hours, 350 Japanese soldiers laid down their weapons under Chen's supervision. They formed orderly lines, stacked rifles and ammunition with the same discipline they had shown in defending the position, and waited with quiet dignity to be processed as prisoners of war. Not a single shot was fired. Not a single act of violence marred the transition. When American reinforcements finally arrived the next morning, brought in by Webb's frantic radio calls once they had moved to higher ground, they found Chen sitting on an ammunition crate, exhausted, surrounded by disarmed enemy soldiers, and unable to fully explain how he had convinced an entire garrison to surrender without the 5,000 troops he had claimed were surrounding them. The prisoners were evacuated first, rushed to field hospitals where doctors marveled that any had survived 3 years of captivity. Several would not make it, their bodies too damaged by starvation and disease, but most would eventually recover and return home to families who'd long since given them up for dead. The Japanese soldiers were transported to prisoner of war camps where they would spend the remainder of the war, and where many would eventually express relief that they had survived when so many of their comrades had perished in pointless last stands across the Pacific. Colonel Yamamoto would spend 2 years in captivity, and after his release would write a memoir in which he described Chen as the most dangerous man he had ever met, not because of his weapons or his threats, but because of his understanding of the human heart and his willingness to offer an honorable escape from an impossible situation. Chen himself was immediately pulled from the field and debriefed by incredulous intelligence officers who could barely believe his report. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor, though it would be downgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross due to bureaucratic concerns about awarding the nation's highest honor for an action that involved deception rather than traditional valor. He would accept the medal without complaint, understanding that the recognition was never the point. The point was the 43 men who went home to their families. The point was the 350 enemy soldiers who survived the war. The point was proving that even in humanity's darkest moments, even in a conflict as brutal as the Pacific War, there was still room for strategy, for psychology, for the possibility that words could triumph where weapons would only have produced more corpses.